What if the storm that once brought New Orleans to its knees returned in a different form today? What if the lessons of the past weren't enough to protect America from nature's fury? And what if, despite 2 decades of investment, policy debates, and scientific advancement, the United States still finds itself vulnerable when the skies turn dark and the waters rise? Hurricane Katrina in 2005 remains one of the most devastating natural disasters in American history. Its images of flooded streets, stranded families on rooftops, and the collapse of vital infrastructure are seared into the nation's memory. Fast forward to 2025, and the question is urgent. Has the country truly built resilience against the next Katrina-level event? Or are the same cracks still waiting to split open under the pressure of another monster storm? This is not just a look back, it's a comparison of what was, what is, and what might be looming on the horizon. Katrina struck with a combination of natural power and human failure. The storm itself was a Category 3 at landfall, but its surge overwhelmed the aging levee system in New Orleans. The city was left defenseless against walls of water, resulting in the flooding of 80% of its land. More than 1,800 lives were lost, and damages surpassed $160 billion, making it the costliest hurricane in US history at that time. But Katrina was never just about wind speed or rainfall totals. It was about neglect, inequality, and the inability of government systems to protect the most vulnerable. Poor evacuation planning, delayed federal response, and structural inequities made a natural disaster into a humanitarian catastrophe. Now in 2025, the US faces another catastrophic hurricane season, with one storm in particular drawing comparisons to Katrina. Meteorologists note eerie similarities: a powerful Gulf Coast landfall, widespread flooding, and mass displacement. But the context has changed. The question for analysts, policymakers, and everyday citizens is whether those changes have truly insulated the nation from another breakdown, or whether progress has been overstated. In the years since Katrina, the federal government invested billions into strengthening New Orleans' levee system. The US Army Corps of Engineers constructed new flood walls, pumps, and surge barriers designed to withstand a storm far stronger than Katrina. For a time, experts praised the system as one of the most sophisticated in the world. Yet climate change has complicated that sense of security. Rising sea levels, warmer ocean temperatures, and more erratic storm tracks mean that the Gulf Coast now faces storms with more rainfall, higher surge potential, and less predictable paths. The protective system built after 2005 was designed for a specific set of assumptions, but nature has shifted the baseline. At the same time, emergency management has transformed. FEMA, often criticized during Katrina for being slow and bureaucratic, has modernized its communication systems, stockpiles, and coordination with states. The proliferation of smartphones and real-time weather apps has revolutionized how citizens receive alerts and evacuation instructions. Social media now plays a critical role in both spreading warnings and documenting conditions on the ground. In theory, these tools should reduce casualties and speed response. But theory is not the same as practice. When hurricanes hit in 2017, Harvey, Irma, Maria, the nation saw both progress and persistent weaknesses. Puerto Rico in particular exposed FEMA's continuing struggles with logistics, while Texas demonstrated the limits of infrastructure when rainfall totals broke all historical records. The storm of 2025, battering Gulf communities and reigniting Katrina comparisons, has brought this tension into the spotlight. In cities like Houston and New Orleans, evacuation routes are more clearly marked, shelters are better prepared, and communication is faster. Yet, once again, poorer neighborhoods face greater risks. Flood-prone areas remain populated because affordable housing is scarce elsewhere. Communities of color still face barriers in evacuation logistics, from access to cars to trust in government officials. These are echoes of Katrina that no wall or pump can fully erase. From a scientific perspective, the storms of 2025 also differ from Katrina in significant ways. Katrina's surge devastated New Orleans because the levees failed, but rainfall totals were not the record-breaking figures we have seen in recent years. Today's hurricanes, fueled by warmer waters, often carry extreme precipitation that lingers over cities. This means inland communities, hundreds of miles from the coast, are increasingly at risk. In fact, the 2025 storm flooded towns along the Mississippi River, where residents felt blindsided, believing hurricanes were a coastal problem. This expansion of the danger zone underscores how climate change has shifted the risk map, making Katrina an incomplete guide for the storms of today. Politically, Katrina marked a turning point in American disaster response. The federal government's failures eroded public trust and became a rallying point for reform. In 2025, disaster response has become more politicized than ever. Climate policies, federal-state coordination, and disaster funding are hot-button issues in Washington. Some argue that new infrastructure projects and emergency systems prove lessons were learned. Others contend that systemic inequalities, compounded by climate change, mean the country remains dangerously unprepared. This divide is not just academic. It shapes where resources go, which communities are prioritized, and how recovery unfolds. Economically, the impact of hurricanes has also evolved. Katrina was devastating, but insurance systems and federal aid, while stretched, absorbed much of the cost. Today, the scale of damages from back-to-back record storms has pushed insurers to retreat from coastal markets. Homeowners across Florida, Louisiana, and Texas struggle to find affordable coverage, leaving millions exposed financially. Federal disaster funds are increasingly strained, raising the question of sustainability. If storms like Katrina become less of an exception and more of a recurring threat, can the US economy continue to absorb the blows without broader structural reform? The psychological legacy of Katrina still lingers in 2025. Survivors remember the chaos, the smell of floodwaters, the haunting silence of neighborhoods left empty. For them, comparisons between Katrina and new storms are not abstract, they are personal. Many rebuilt only to be threatened again by rising seas and stronger storms. Younger generations, too, have grown up in a world where the big one is not just a historical event, but a recurring possibility. This shapes how communities prepare, how families make decisions, and how people imagine their futures. Some wonder if parts of the Gulf Coast will eventually become unlivable, a question unthinkable in 2005, but increasingly debated today. The media's framing of storms has also changed. During Katrina, images of suffering shocked viewers, but also reinforced stereotypes of poverty and helplessness. In 2025, coverage is more fragmented across platforms, but the immediacy of live streams and citizen reporting brings disasters into homes with unfiltered intensity. This democratization of coverage exposes government failures more quickly, but also floods the public with conflicting narratives. Trust in official information is contested, with some communities relying more on neighbors and local networks than on federal or state broadcasts. In weighing whether America is safer today than it was during Katrina, the answer is layered. On one level, yes, levees are stronger, communication is faster, and emergency systems are better funded. On another level, no. Climate change has raised the stakes, and social inequalities continue to place certain populations at greater risk. Safety is not absolute. It is conditional, relative, and fragile. The storms of 2025 prove that progress does not mean invulnerability. Instead, it highlights the paradox of disaster preparedness. The more we prepare for yesterday's storm, the more we may be blindsided by tomorrow's. Looking back, Katrina was both a natural and a social disaster. Looking forward, storms in 2025 are testing whether the nation has truly learned that distinction. Infrastructure and policy matter, but so do justice, equity, and foresight. The nation has hardened its defenses, but nature has hardened its assault. The race between resilience and risk is ongoing, and the finish line keeps moving farther away. The real measure of safety is not whether the levees hold or the shelters open. It is whether every citizen, regardless of income or race, has a fair chance of survival. It is whether communities can rebuild not just houses, but trust. And it is whether leaders, faced with a changing climate, have the courage to move beyond reactive fixes toward transformative change. Katrina was a warning. The storms of 2025 are a test. The outcome will define not just the Gulf Coast, but the future of America's relationship with its most relentless adversary, the rising force of water and wind. When Hurricane Katrina tore through the Gulf Coast in 2005, it revealed not only the destructive power of nature, but also the fragility of America's disaster preparedness. The failures of communication, infrastructure, and coordination were so glaring that they reshaped how the country thought about storms. In the years that followed, every new hurricane has been measured against that disaster, as though Katrina remains the yardstick of vulnerability. Yet in 2025, when a new storm system unleashed devastation across coastal and inland communities, the comparisons were more than symbolic. They were a reminder that nature tests even the most fortified societies in ways we never anticipate. Part of the challenge in measuring progress since Katrina lies in understanding what safety really means. Does it mean stronger walls and better pumps? Does it mean faster government response times? Or does it mean that every citizen, no matter where they live or how much they earn, has an equal chance of survival when the winds rise and the waters surge? The Katrina of 2005 was a storm of failures layered on top of each other. Forecasting was accurate enough to warn that disaster was imminent, but communication breakdowns left many residents unaware of the severity. Evacuation orders were late and uneven, with wealthier citizens driving out of town while the poorest were left stranded. When the levees failed, it was not a surprise to engineers who had long warned about their weakness, yet those warnings had been ignored for decades. Emergency response from federal, state, and local agencies became a case study in confusion, delay, and missed opportunities. The images of thousands crammed into the Superdome without adequate food, water, or medical care became symbols of governmental abandonment. For many Americans, especially African Americans in New Orleans, Katrina was not only a natural disaster, but also a moral indictment of a country that allowed its most vulnerable to drown. Fast forward to 2025, and the landscape looks different, but only on the surface. The Gulf Coast now boasts a multi-billion-dollar hurricane and storm damage risk reduction system, a sprawling network of levees, surge barriers, and pumps designed to withstand a 100-year storm. Cities across Texas and Florida have invested in elevated highways, floodgates, and expanded drainage systems. Federal agencies have rolled out integrated early warning systems, while state governments coordinate evacuations with real-time traffic monitoring. On paper, America is far safer. Yet when the 2025 storm struck, packing unprecedented rainfall and a surge higher than forecasts anticipated, entire neighborhoods found themselves in peril again. The new infrastructure held in many places, but in others, drainage systems collapsed under the weight of record precipitation. Inland towns hundreds of miles from the Gulf watched their streets transform into rivers, a scenario many had never prepared for. The storm reminded the nation that safety is not a destination, but a constantly moving target, one shaped by a climate system that grows more unpredictable each year. One of the starkest differences between Katrina and the storms of 2025 lies in technology. During Katrina, social media barely existed. Information was broadcast through television and radio, and once power was lost, so too were the lifelines of communication. In 2025, smartphones have become ubiquitous, and platforms from X to TikTok to decentralized alert apps now deliver storm warnings instantly. Families track the movement of the storm in real time, and evacuation routes are shared across networks with crowdsourced updates. Drones provide aerial images of flood zones within hours, giving emergency managers eyes on the ground that would have been unimaginable in 2005. Artificial intelligence even helps forecast storm surge patterns with greater precision. These tools should make survival more attainable for everyone. Yet the reality is more complicated. Misinformation also spreads with lightning speed, creating confusion during critical hours. Some residents distrust official alerts, believing rumors that the storm will weaken or bypass their area. In an age of information abundance, clarity has become harder, not easier to achieve. Social inequality, which Katrina so brutally exposed, continues to shape outcomes in 2025. Wealthier residents often have insurance, savings, and mobility, while poorer households live in flood-prone areas because those are the only places they can afford. For many low-income families, Evacuation means leaving behind jobs, pets, and the uncertainty of whether they will be able to return. While emergency shelters are better equipped now than they were in 2005, they remain overcrowded, and some families avoid them out of fear of crime or mistreatment. The 2025 storm again revealed the divide between those who could check into hotels hundreds of miles away and those who were left waiting in line for a cot in a gymnasium. Progress since Katrina has been real, but it has not been evenly distributed. Disasters continue to magnify inequality, turning storms into social fault lines as much as meteorological events. Another area where comparisons reveal both advancement and limitation is in government response. During Katrina, FEMA became a symbol of dysfunction. Supplies sat in warehouses while survivors begged for help. Today, FEMA has streamlined logistics with pre-positioned supplies, digital registration for aid, and stronger coordination with state agencies. Within hours of the 2025 storm, relief trucks rolled into affected regions, and helicopters delivered water and medicine to isolated towns. Yet despite these improvements, the sheer scale of the disaster stretched resources thin. Hospitals filled beyond capacity, supply lines jammed, and requests for rescue outpaced available teams. The federal government has become more nimble, but storms have also become more destructive, raising the question of whether the improvements can ever truly keep up. The psychological landscape of disaster is another dimension worth examining. In 2005, Katrina produced shock and disbelief. The images of a major American city underwater were almost surreal, as though such devastation belonged to another time or another part of the world. In 2025, however, storms of catastrophic magnitude no longer shock in the same way. They have become part of a grim rhythm. Harvey in 2017, Ida in 2021, Ian in 2022, and now another unnamed giant in 2025. The normalization of extreme weather has bred both resilience and fatigue. Some communities are better organized, with neighbors forming response networks and churches acting as logistical hubs. Others, however, are weary from repeated rebuilds, insurance battles, and the creeping realization that this may never end. The question has shifted from how do we recover to how many more times can we recover before we are forced to leave. Insurance and economics further complicate the picture. After Katrina, insurance payouts were massive but manageable within the industry. In the decades since, however, the escalating cost of hurricanes has driven insurers to retreat from entire states. In 2025, many homeowners discovered their policies excluded flood damage or had lapsed altogether because insurers pulled out of coastal markets. The result was devastating. Families not only lost homes but also had no financial means to rebuild. Federal disaster aid, while available, was insufficient to cover full losses. This raises profound questions about the sustainability of coastal living. If private insurers will no longer bear the cost, and federal funds are increasingly strained, who will carry the burden? The economic fallout of the 2025 storm suggests that America may face a future where certain regions become uninsurable and thus effectively uninhabitable for all but the wealthy. Politically, both Katrina and the 2025 storm have become defining moments. Katrina eroded faith in President George W. Bush's administration as the sluggish response tarnished his reputation. In 2025, the storm has already become a lightning rod in partisan debates over climate change, infrastructure spending, and federal-state coordination. Some argue that the investments made after Katrina saved countless lives and prevented even greater catastrophe. Others argue that those investments were piecemeal, failing to account for the acceleration of climate risks. Political leaders now face a dilemma, doubling down on costly defenses or acknowledging that retreat from certain areas may be the only sustainable strategy. Both options carry profound economic and cultural consequences. When comparing Katrina to the storms of 2025, one cannot ignore the global dimension. Katrina shocked the world in 2005 because it exposed American vulnerability in a way few expected. 2 decades later, the US is no longer unique in facing catastrophic storms. From the Philippines to Mozambique, extreme cyclones are devastating coastal populations with growing frequency. The 2025 storm fits into a global pattern, underscoring how climate change is not only reshaping America's Gulf Coast, but threatening human settlements worldwide. In this sense, Katrina was a warning shot for the planet, and 2025 storms are a reminder that the warning went largely unheeded. The cultural memory of Katrina also casts a long shadow. In music, literature, and film, Katrina became a symbol of abandonment, resilience, and the collision of race and class with disaster. Today's storm survivors inherit that legacy, framing their own experiences in light of 2005. For some, the comparison is empowering, proof that their communities can endure and rebuild once more. For others, it is a cruel reminder that the same injustices persist, that promises of never again ring hollow when viewed against the floodwaters rising in 2025. The narrative of resilience, while inspiring, cannot erase the deeper question: why must communities be resilient again and again instead of protected in the first place? Ultimately, the comparison between Katrina and the storms of 2025 reveals both undeniable progress and sobering continuity. America is more prepared in terms of infrastructure, technology, and coordination. Yet the scale of the threat has grown, fueled by a climate system that intensifies storms beyond historical models. The inequalities that magnified Katrina's devastation remain embedded in society, shaping who lives, who dies, and who recovers. The central question, whether America is safer, cannot be answered with a simple yes or no. It is safer in some ways, but more vulnerable in others. Progress has been made, but the target keeps moving, and the waters keep rising. The story of Katrina was not only about a hurricane, but about a nation confronting its failures. The storms of 2025 carry the same lesson forward. Nature will always find the weak points, whether in levees, in politics, or in social fabric. The task is not merely to build stronger walls, but to build a stronger society, one where protection is not a privilege, but a guarantee. Without that, the ghosts of Katrina will continue to haunt every hurricane season, reminding America that safety is never just about surviving the storm. It is about ensuring that everyone has the chance to do so. When Hurricane Katrina made landfall in 2005, it did more than devastate New Orleans and the Gulf Coast. It left a wound on the American psyche. It was the disaster that revealed the cracks in governance, the vulnerability of infrastructure, and the persistence of social inequities that turned a natural catastrophe into a humanitarian crisis. 20 years later, in 2025, America finds itself once again reckoning with storms that rival or even surpass Katrina's power. The question is not whether the nation has learned from that defining tragedy, but whether those lessons have been applied deeply enough to withstand the evolving threat of climate change. The comparison between 2005 and 2025 forces us to confront a difficult truth. Progress has been made, but vulnerability remains deeply etched into the nation's fabric. In Katrina's wake, the images that shocked the world were not just of water breaching levees, but of stranded families waving desperately from rooftops, of the elderly left in nursing homes without evacuation, and of thousands crowded into the Superdome in conditions that resembled a refugee camp. The disaster was compounded by slow federal response, poor state-level coordination, and deep mistrust between marginalized communities and government institutions. The storm did not discriminate in where it landed, but its impact was anything but equal. Low-income neighborhoods bore the brunt of flooding, while wealthier residents were more likely to have the resources to evacuate. This legacy of disparity continues to shape disaster outcomes today, even as the tools and technologies of preparedness have evolved. The storms of 2025, striking with record-breaking rainfall and surges, highlight a paradox of progress. On the one hand, the levee systems around New Orleans, rebuilt and strengthened after Katrina, largely held against the onslaught. Billions of dollars in engineering projects succeeded in preventing the kind of catastrophic levee breaches that drowned the city in 2005. On the other hand, the sheer volume of rainfall overwhelmed drainage systems not designed for such extremes, submerging neighborhoods in standing water for days. Inland towns far from the Gulf Coast also found themselves unprepared, blindsided by rivers that swelled beyond their banks after days of relentless precipitation. This shift reveals how climate change is rewriting the rules. It is not only coastal cities at risk, but entire regions. One cannot ignore the role of technology in this comparison. In 2005, communication breakdowns left thousands in the dark about evacuation orders and relief efforts. By contrast, in 2025, smartphones, apps, and social media allow warnings to spread instantly. Families can track storm movements on live radar and share evacuation updates with relatives hundreds of miles away. Drones are deployed for rapid damage assessment, and satellites provide real-time images to first responders. Yet technology has introduced new risks. False information spreads rapidly, creating confusion and sometimes discouraging evacuation. The digital divide also means that not everyone benefits equally. Families without reliable internet access or smartphones may miss critical updates, leaving them vulnerable despite the abundance of available information. Another critical comparison lies in governance. FEMA's failure during Katrina became emblematic of government dysfunction. Delays in deploying resources, confusion in leadership, and inadequate preparation led to widespread suffering. Today, FEMA is faster and better organized, with pre-positioned supplies, stronger coordination, and digital systems for aid applications. During the 2025 storm, supplies reached certain communities within hours, and rescues were launched quickly using improved logistics. But the sheer magnitude of the disaster once again stretched capacity. Hospitals overflowed, fuel supplies ran short, and rural areas were cut off for days. The federal government is faster, but the storms are fiercer, and gaps remain in areas where poverty and geography intersect to create maximum vulnerability. Economics are another lens through which the two eras can be compared. Katrina caused over $160 billion in damages, then the most expensive natural disaster in US history. The storms of 2025 may rival or exceed that, not because a single city was overwhelmed, but because damages stretched across multiple states. The rising cost of rebuilding has created an insurance crisis. In many coastal states, insurers have withdrawn from markets altogether, leaving homeowners without affordable coverage. Families who lose their homes are discovering that aid does not cover full rebuilding costs, forcing many to abandon their communities permanently. In this sense, America is facing not only natural disasters, but also an economic disaster that threatens the viability of entire regions. Katrina raised questions about recovery. The storms of 2025 raise questions about permanence. The psychological scars also run deep. Survivors of Katrina who rebuilt their homes and their lives now watch as their children face similar displacements 2 decades later. For them, the echoes of 2005 are haunting. For younger generations, extreme weather has become a recurring backdrop to life, shaping a worldview in which catastrophe is normal, not exceptional. This normalization is dangerous. It risks desensitizing the public, reducing urgency for long-term solutions. Yet it also sparks grassroots resilience. Communities organize mutual aid networks, churches act as shelters, and local leaders fill gaps where government responses falter. Resilience is real, but it comes at the cost of exhaustion, and in some cases, abandonment of entire neighborhoods. The political landscape has also shifted. Katrina damaged President Bush's reputation, eroding public trust. In 2025, disasters have become deeply politicized in the context of climate change. One side points to stronger levees, improved communication, and more robust evacuations as evidence of progress. The other side highlights uninsured families, overwhelmed infrastructure, and disproportionate impacts on marginalized groups as proof that America remains dangerously unprepared. Policy debates center not only on recovery, but on adaptation. Should the government continue pouring billions into rebuilding at-risk regions, or should it begin facilitating managed retreat from areas deemed too vulnerable to sustain? It is a politically explosive question, one with cultural and economic consequences that will shape the future of entire states. Globally, the US is not alone. Hurricanes in the Atlantic, typhoons in the Pacific, and cyclones in the Indian Ocean are all intensifying under a warming climate. Katrina was once seen as a uniquely American failure, but in 2025, the world recognizes these disasters as shared challenges. Still, the wealth of the US gives it resources that many nations lack. If even America struggles to protect its people, what does that mean for the rest of the world? The lessons of Katrina should have spurred global change, But instead, humanity has watched as storms grow stronger, seas rise higher, and adaptation struggles to keep pace. Perhaps the most sobering comparison is the persistence of inequality. In 2005, race and poverty determined who lived and who died, who evacuated and who was left behind. In 2025, despite better systems, those same patterns persist. Low-income families still live in flood-prone areas. Evacuation still requires cars, gas, and the ability to miss work without losing wages. Insurance markets still favor the wealthy, leaving the poor to rebuild with little support. Infrastructure projects protect business districts, while low-income neighborhoods flood again and again. Progress is real, but justice is uneven. So, has America become safer since Katrina? In some ways, yes. Levees are stronger, communication is faster, and FEMA is more agile. But in other ways, the risks are greater than ever. Climate change is intensifying storms beyond historical benchmarks. Economic systems like insurance are faltering under repeated strain. Social inequalities continue to magnify suffering. Safety is not an absolute. It is conditional, relative, and fragile. Katrina was the disaster that warned America of its weaknesses. The storms of 2025 are the disasters that prove those weaknesses persist. This story is more than a comparison of two eras. It is a warning that time is running out. America cannot rely on rebuilding after every storm. It cannot afford to treat disaster response as an endless cycle of damage and repair. What is needed now is transformation, a willingness to rethink where and how people live, to confront the realities of climate change head-on, and to ensure that protection is not a privilege, but a right for every citizen. Katrina taught us what happens when systems fail. The storms of 2025 show us what happens when the threat itself evolves faster than our response. And that brings us to you, the viewer. Disasters are not just headlines or statistics. They are lived realities that affect families, communities, and futures. The question of whether America is safer today than it was in 2005 is not just about policy or infrastructure. It is about whether we have the courage to confront uncomfortable truths and demand better. If these stories matter to you, if you believe that understanding the lessons of Katrina and applying them to today's storms is vital for America's safety, then join us on this journey. Subscribe to Crisis Lens, where we dive deep into the storms shaping our world, exposing vulnerabilities, analyzing policies, and exploring solutions. Together, we can hold leaders accountable, amplify the voices of survivors, and shine a light on the urgent questions of our time. Don't just watch the storm. Be part of the conversation that determines how we weather it.